Thank you, Nick. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Survival of the warmest, perhaps, today. Glad you could make it. Our Darwin Day party last night was a little smaller than usual due to the weather, but I think we made up for it in silliness. It's really our big excuse to have a party in the doldrums of winter, so I appreciate everybody who helped with that. We're having a small children's party this afternoon as well afterwards, which should be fun. So the 12th of February, Darwin's birthday, is celebrated by humanists around the world. And today I'm going to offer, as I have for the last 2 years, a talk having to do with our relationship with animals. Let there be more light. Good. Thank you, Steve. I'm going to touch about this on a number of things, mainly about what inspiration we can draw as human beings concerning nature, ourselves, and our relationship to animals. 2 years ago, I discussed this topic, focusing a little bit more on how we as human beings project our own negative qualities, our own evil parts, perhaps, if you wish, onto animals as a way of dealing with them. I talked about how Plato described the animal parts of us as the, quote, wild beasts within us, and how Western culture continues to sort of condemn the bodily and the physical and praise higher capacities like reason almost exclusively, which justified a lot of Western philosophical approaches like Kant's approach when he said that animals are, quote, entirely at the disposal of man. Okay? So there's this emphasis on degrading the animal. I talked also 2 years ago about how in 1920 Felix Adler, the person who started ethical culture, described human psychology in ways that sort of smeared our animal cousins. He said, quote, one must distinguish between two selves in everyone, between the animal self and the divine unclouded self. Those instincts, those sensual infirmities, those cruelties, those crushing instincts are part of our animal heritage. As if there was nothing good about our animal heritage. But that's a tradition in Western philosophy that we need to root out in general. We paint wolves as vicious and dangerous and solitary and untrustworthy, when in fact they are exactly the opposite. If anybody have read Farley Mawat's Never Quite Wolf. We also, they rarely hurt their own members, and they're very good parents. We talk about rats as being treacherous, when in fact they rarely attack members of their own tribe, much less than human beings do. We call sharks vicious killing machines, when sharks only kill for food or when provoked. And I grew up, after watching a lot of Tarzan movies, thinking that gorillas were just looking for humans to eat. When in fact, it's the hunter in the jungle that is probably the most bloodthirsty creature in the Tarzan movie. So I've shared how far we've come thanks to Jane Goodall, who, despite some of the disagreements Bob Kay has, I feel really showed us how human gorillas were. Her respect for and, in fact, love for these animals helped me think very differently about animals. 2 years ago, I discussed how Peter Singer, in his book Animal Liberation, states, quote, if a being suffers, there can be no moral justification for refusing to take that suffering into consideration, regardless of the species, basically, right? Last year, I talked a little bit more how we use animals in many different ways, like for food. I talked about Leonardo da Vinci, who said that meat eating was the equivalent of murdering human beings. I gave you the quote from George Bernard Shaw saying, animals are my friends and I don't eat my friends. I like that. I brought up how the use and abuse of animals in medical testing and product testing is close to cross-species torture. Now, I live in a glass house because I don't do everything that I think I should do regarding my relationship to animals. Some of my belts are still leather. I'll eat meat on occasion. I've tried to cut down. I even have a pet in a cage, a cockatiel. I talked last year about whether we should even consider giving up our pet owning. Pets give and receive great affection from human beings. They're our guides, our companions, our barometers for epileptic seizures. They're literally lifesavers. So are we going to go so far as to say that the only ethically pure relationship we can have with animals is one where they have total autonomy and distance? Last year I said no. And I said no, and I say again today, because I believe those relationships are full of love and respect between the creatures in some way. Empathy is what I'm going to focus on today. In general, and between humans and animals. The background of this talk involves continuing research, new research about the conscious experience of animals and how different it is. We're discovering more and more that animals have much more vibrant experiences than we have ever thought. We know that fish can be self-aware now, believe it or not, that some animals, especially elephants, suffer post-traumatic stress syndrome. Young elephants who witness their parents being killed by poachers and then are separated, in one study, had the same symptoms that children in Africa who are stolen by terrorists and forced to be in an army away from their family have the same symptoms. They have sort of erratic, detached behavior, and there's an interesting paper comparing that. Elephants go to where their ancestors died and mourn over their bones years later. And these findings, I think, challenge us and how we should raise our children. Now, I'll admit that my kids taught me more than I taught them about animals. Maureen and I raised them as omnivores, but all three of them are vegetarians. One's a vegan. Now, maybe that's no surprise because we live in the People's Republic of Tacoma Park, outside of Maryland, D.C., where there are more pita trucks and vegan food than you can anywhere, I think. It's an old hippie bastion. But I think what else could have contributed to them becoming vegetarians, and I take some credit because I think we raised them to think for themselves. Bob Kay advises as well that we give them enough freedom and downtime to play, explore, and trust their curiosity. And I think we did that for our kids. I'm going to talk about this aspect of education in a platform later this spring about education. But our home was basically like most homes for kids. It was full of cuddly stuffed animals. Again, I'm quoting Bob because he feeds me these articles. This is one from the New York Times. The title is Rolling Over for Cute Animal Videos. Why is it that animal videos are one of the leading YouTube hits? We love furry little creatures. There's a handout about how animals run and play and how we should encourage our children to do this. And we do that by using these fake animals. Now, my kids certainly developed empathy through the books and the movies that we had involving animals that acted human, for example. And one was Dumbo, the circus elephant. How many remember seeing Dumbo? Tragic story. My wife and he were watching this, and it had involved Mrs. Jumbo, who was defending poor Dumbo because he had large ears. He was teased by the other circus elephants. So Mrs. Jumbo runs to his defense and then is captured and put away as a mad elephant, separated. And I come back down into our playroom where my wife and son is, which was Sean, who's now 27, he was 6 at the time. We're watching Dumbo, and they are crying and sobbing. And Maureen is saying, I tried to explain why they took his mother away, and it only made it worse. I mean, it was such a powerful experience. And I wonder, I asked Sean, did that help contribute to his empathy for animals and why he became a vegan? He says, he's not sure. But I thought maybe. So it makes me wonder a little bit more about it. Joe Bonus gave me the book Wicked, which has some episodes in it about animals and humans and how we treat each other. And through all literature, there's these elements that focus on feeling animals and what empathy or relationships we have with them. So I want to talk about empathy and what it is and what it isn't. Its definition is the capacity to share or recognize emotions experienced by another sentient or fictional being. So Ian King, in his 2008 book called Solving the Riddle of Right and Wrong, suggests that empathy is the essence, or he calls it the DNA of our moral concepts of right and wrong. He argues that this foundation is what we build the rest of our ethical frameworks on. And he says that it's partially self-standing. That's the words he used, partially self-standing. What I think he means by that is that it's not something you have to prove. It's direct, it's clear, it just is. It's self-evident. Philosopher Michael Stowe places it front and center in his book called The Ethics of Care and Empathy. And he maintains that without empathy, morality itself would have very little role in human life. It's different than obligation, he talks about, but it carries moral weight. Buddhists believe it's the center of their ethics. Empathy is a big part of any type of learning, I think. I mean, I taught history for 25 years, and I always would ask the kids, imagine what it would have been like to. And if they couldn't empathize, that wouldn't have a lot of meaning to them. It only makes sense in our ability to empathize. Sociologist Sam Richards explained to his students when they asked him, "What is sociology?" He answered first, "It's the study of the way in which human beings are shaped by things that they don't see." When they followed up by asking, "So how can I be a sociologist? How can I understand these invisible things?" He replied, "Empathy. Start with empathy. It all begins with empathy. Take yourself out of your shoes and put yourself into the shoes of another person." So, empathy is different than compassion or sympathy. Compassion is an emotion that we feel when we see somebody in need or in distress. It can be mild. It doesn't necessarily demand that we take action. Sympathy is related, more directly involves feeling for another person, feeling perhaps pity for somebody else. And one can feel compassion and sympathy, but still maintain a distance. We do it in movies and books all the time. But empathy involves a more radical, imaginative leap. It involves understanding the emotional states of other people. It's not about my feelings. It's about feeling the feelings of another person. Now, some of you, and sometimes myself, think that maybe that's impossible. I mean, my feelings are my feelings, your feelings are your feelings. So there's that issue. But at least we can appreciate, I think, that empathy is more intense and more direct than sympathy or compassion. Especially when the consciousness of the other person we're trying to empathize with, or the other creature, is intense or involves pain or suffering. Empathizers who empathize with people in distress can feel very uncomfortable. They can have a sense of emotional distress or helplessness or victim blaming or paralysis. Strong empathy can actually retard how much we act because we are suffering along with the sufferer. Young children empathize very easily and naturally, which is why exposure to violence in like films at a young age can be quite toxic to them. They have less of an ability to distinguish between themselves and others, and they don't have methods of processing these strong emotions. So they're often overwhelmed by seeing others in distress. They easily connect with what's called the affective or the emotional aspect of empathy, which is only one part of when people study empathy. It's only one part of empathy. Something that some researchers call empathetic maturity involves two things. One is the feeling aspect, that affective empathy, but they also talk about something called cognitive empathy, in addition to feelings. Now, cognitive empathy is the ability to understand that some other creature is having an authentic experience like your own. And this involves what researchers call a theory of mind. It's a conceptual scheme that includes clear appreciation for others having experiences like mine. Most believe that young children don't have that until they're about 4 years old. They don't have the capacity to really grasp that fully. Some say children with autism have trouble having that experience. So as far as affective empathy, that feeling part is, I think there are learned parts and there are innate parts. I mean, very young babies imitate parents' faces, smiles or frowns, almost seems naturally, but that's a part of the teaching process, I think. When they get a little older, discussing children's feelings, I think, is an important thing to do. Talking about how they're feeling and how their body's feeling and what facial expressions are giving can improve this empathetic maturity. You can even use a mirror to explore what the children is feeling and how it's reflecting in their face. When comparing the affective or emotional and the cognitive parts of empathetic maturity, researchers were surprised to find that cognitive empathy is a bigger predictor for behavior. In other words, if somebody's going to make a difference to help somebody else's suffering, they find that it's not just the feeling aspect, it's actually understanding that the other person is another conscious center that leads them to help that person more. So in teaching empathy, it's not just about including this focus on feeling, which is why one reason when I raise my kids, I try to avoid just focusing on their feelings and trying to get them to see the other person. So instead of saying, if some kid took all the cookies off the plate at a party, instead of saying to that child, "How come you took all those cookies? How selfish you are. Why are you doing that?" Instead, you could say, "How do you think Mary feels about having no cookies?" So that cognitive ability to make that a leap is very, very important. Now, extremely egocentric people, or people who are close to being involved in sort of a psychopathic relationship with the world, don't experience others as centers of experience. So while they may have emotionally intense lives themselves, they have a hard time appreciating other people as having centers of experiences, and they can commit terrible acts. And I wonder how, on a lesser scale, that involves our ability to distance ourselves from animals. So the point I want to make is that empathy is more than just feeling. It can be augmented through parenting and education. Now, I mentioned that there's this surge of brain science going on in animals. Way back in 1863, T.X. Huxley, who was one of Darwin's main defenders, said that there is, quote, no cerebral barrier between man and apes. Scotty was giving an article in which the journalist Charles Siebert visits a large walk-in closet full of brains floating in vats. These brains are in formaldehyde, and they're humans, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, dolphins, porpoises, orcas, belugas, bisons, and bats. And they were all part of this collection of a neuroscientist called Patrick Hoff. And through advanced neuroimaging technology, Hoff discovered that despite some differences, brains exhibit very similar complex cortices and limbic systems, which process emotion and thinking and perceiving. Researchers, for example, found that macaque monkeys have 11 of 12 of the regions that humans have in our brains. Hoff also found that there are special neurons called spindle cells that were previously assumed to only exist in humans, but in fact are found in sea mammals and elephants. And these spindle cells are associated with self-awareness, empathy, and a sense of compassion. And he's working with animal rights activists now to gain animals' rights so that they can be protected based on the fact that they feel this. He says that chimps, for example, have possession of, quote, an autobiographical self, episodic memory, self-determination, self-consciousness, empathy, and so on. So he's debunking claims that animals only experience the present, for example. And he suggests that, in fact, chimpanzees, quote, like humans, have a concept of their personal past and future, and they suffer pain from anticipating never-ending confinement. Which is really interesting, that they actually understand that, am I stuck in here forever? Never crossed my mind that that would be something that a chimp would be able to conceptualize. Now, I don't know whether that concept affected me more, or the fact that I didn't realize just the other day, that chimpanzees' blood is interchangeable with human blood as long as the types are the same. I know, it's kind of creepy. I didn't realize that. So all this continuing research into empathy, scientists have also isolated something called mirror neurons. In human brains, these people who have very strong empathetic test scores also are found to have highly active mirror neurons. So there's a connection in the biology. They help us imagine being in somebody else's shoes, is what researchers are claiming. A paper by the famous naturalist Franz de Waal and his assistant Stephanie Preston explain how these mirror neurons discovered in monkeys fire when a monkey acts or sees a monkey doing the same action, that the firing is similar. So the brain is doing the same thing when they're doing it as when they're watching some other monkey do it, which does make you think that there is this ability to understand the consciousness of others. And he says, one researcher at the University of Chicago says that deep evolutionary biochemical and neurological underpinnings form, even in the most advanced and old forms of life, discover empathy in human beings built on the most basic forms of physiology. So, I'm not a scientist, but all this research is indicating that there's much more there than we knew before. How do they hold us together with animals? I spoke some about gorillas and chimps. One researcher talked about bonobo chimpanzees, and how when they witness other bonobos in distress, they act very much like humans do. They go for bodily contact and reassurance, even more so than when they are in distress. The anxiety there. The coping mechanisms are very similar. And that they found also that bonobo chimps who are orphaned by their mothers have a harder time empathizing later in life, which makes me wonder, how much nurturance and teaching does to help animals like ourselves feel empathy. One researcher, Tom Wolfe, found that sea mammals have 3 times more spindle cells than human beings. So in fact, sea mammals might empathize more easily than human beings do. You've heard stories of dolphins that save human beings from drownings and shark attacks. It happens quite often. Dogs display very great empathy for human beings, whether they're an owner or a stranger. I mean, sometimes you can program them to attack strangers, but researchers are finding that basically there's very little canine behavior change when a human being is just talking or humming or something, but when a human being is crying, whether they're strangers or not, dogs will come up and nuzzle and try to reassure the human being in a very submissive manner. Okay, so this is kind of commonplace stuff. But scientists believe that rodents even have empathetic responses. I mean, we definitely, talk about rats as this ugly thing in our sort of cultural archetypes. But rodents are, in fact, some of the most empathetic. They actually, they found that for rats, they console other rodents when they're suffering from pain. And mice react more strongly to their own pain after witnessing another mouse undergoing pain. So like they're anticipating it, or they're seeing the warning signs of it. Again, is this showing that these mice have empathy? Some researchers go so far as to say well, actually, this is not unreasonable, that mother hens act very much in empathetic manners, that when a chick is in danger, their heartbeat rises, their temperature rises, they stop preening and they cluck in alarm. And some go so far as to even say that ants experience empathy. In one study, Mediterranean ants were found to rescue their other ants by pulling sand apart, right? And pulling boulders out of the way, getting the ants free. It's a stretch for my imagination to think that ants have empathy in the same way that I do. But I wonder how much of that is just my, assumptions and my bias towards what I consider the specialness of human beings. I don't know. Sometimes I wonder whether my attempts to nurture empathy for other animals, both other people treating other animals and how I treat other animals, would be more effective through stories than through science. I've given you some science facts. It's easy for stories to become unscientific and sort of romantic generalizations about animals, but stories are also very good at teaching us about ourselves. With that in mind, I want to conclude with a bit of a story from a New York Times article by Deborah Kossman called A Tale of Two Primates. This was a story in the New York Times that I found awfully intriguing. Deborah was a media relations manager at the Philadelphia Zoo, just a few miles away from here, where she worked unhappily for a number of years. Kossman begins by sharing how humans see in animals what we want to see. She describes sitting in her office at the zoo, which had a window out to the polar bear exhibit, and the children would sit next to the glass under the water and scream and giggle as the big polar bears would smack their paws against the glass, and the parents would reassure them, saying, "Oh, the bear's just playing." And Deborah would laugh to her friend on the phone and saying, "The polar bears are trying to kill the kids again." Because that's what they were doing. They were going to eat the kids if they could get through to them. So she talks about this, and talks about her favorite spot in the zoo, which was at the Rare Mammal House, which is where the world's oldest captive gorilla, Masa, lived for many years. Now Masa, she writes about in this way. She says, "Gorillas are social creatures, and I would find Masa sitting alone in his exhibit, thoughtfully noshing on a piece of lettuce, watching visitors as they passed. I thought he had sad eyes. I felt I could relate to Masa. If I did my job as best I could, then I would be proud. But in the early days, I spent a lot of time crying and trying not to cry. I was terrified I'd be found out. A fraud, the girl who knows nothing. I was an English major. I slept through my biology lectures where I might have gleaned the difference between a phylum and a genus, figuring that this would rarely come into my adult life. But every morning I'd drive to the zoo, from my apartment in the West City, through Fairmount Park, to the zoo, tearful, stressing about all the things I had to do, and certain that I would never understand how to do them. My days off, my days were filled with calls to reporters, writing news releases, and deciphering how the zoo operated. I felt it impossibly hard. I'd often cry on the way home, too. Masa and I would meet for lunch, regularly at his enclosure. No one knew then how long gorillas lasted in the wild, and my official news releases his longevity was attributed to zoo cakes, which the Philadelphia Zoo had created as a healthy diet for captive animals. In reality, Massa had a uniquely Philadelphia taste for tasty cakes, particularly crimpets, and for Kool-Aid, which his keepers secretly gave him as a treat in a big bowl. He was a junk food junkie. I'd go to see him when I was lonely, and I'd talk with him, especially when I was anxious. My boss is crazy, and there's no way for me to do all the work I have to do, I'd tell him. He'd stare at me with wise eyes and listen as I tried to figure it out. I felt that he was my zoo-based therapist, as I was only seeing my real therapist once a week. The process of speaking to Massa seemed similar. A lot cheaper too, I guess. I'd talk to him after he'd listen, and he'd listen. After being with Massa, I'd tell myself, if he's lived here 50 years, then I can spend another week. Kaufman understood that Massa's lonely life was due to the fact that Massa was raised by a human being and could not be returned to the wild or with other gorillas because he couldn't socialize with them, he would get hurt. So they had this tightly lined up relationship, and this highly intelligent social creature was limited to these rare moments just with human beings, rarely touching. So the relationship was deeply meaningful, probably for both of them, for Kaufman and Massa. She continued, perhaps I also tried to be a therapist for him. My understanding about healthy relationships grew from my own therapy. My therapist waited patiently while I tried to communicate my feelings. Eventually, I understood and appreciated my own heart because of her gentleness with me. Because of what I'd been given in her office, later, when I fell in love, I was freer. I was able to speak to someone who wanted to hear me. I thought Massa looked at me as a lover might. He seemed to long for the same kind of connection and closeness with another human being that I longed for at that time. With Massa, it was always as if he could see the green hiding in me, the unripened fruit that would eventually turn golden and drop richly into my human lover's hands. The call woke me at 2 a.m. on December 31st, 1984. Massa had died. The animal supervisor needed the pathologist to help him carry Massa's huge body from his enclosure down to the Penrose Lab, an old brick building housed at the zoo hospital. All that day, the animal supervisor and I handled hundreds of telephone calls and media visits. We told Massa's story over and over. People who loved Massa also called. They wanted to leave their condolences. It was a slow news day, which meant that this got international coverage. We are saddened by this loss of our most beloved residents, I would say again and again and again. Repeating this obituary so many times made my own grieving worse. After his death, I went back to the pathology room in Penrose. By the time I got there, the big metal table with the unturned sides only held the bloody instruments of the procedure. His heart and arteries, examined by the zoo's staff, parts of his brains were sent to Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore and the Montefiore Medical Center in the Bronx for further study. His bones went to an anthropologist who reconstructed the skeletons of prehistoric primates. Massa had lived to 54. The pathologist deemed that his cause of death was coronary artery disease. He likely lived far longer than a typical gorilla would have lived in the wild, but I couldn't help thinking that over time his heart might have hardened from his solitary existence. I imagined his veins and arteries closing up, becoming narrower and narrower, till there was only the whisper of life, and then nothing. I still have a big poster of him in my office, a mock-up of the Time magazine Man of the Year cover, which had been made for his 50th birthday celebration. You get into the zoo free if you brought him a birthday card. I made him birthday cake the last time, putting a pint of ice cream, lots of fruit and whipped cream on the top of a large piece of zoo cake. Standing high on a ladder, I leaned over his enclosure and I hung the crepe paper, some cards, and the cut-out happy birthday sign. He sat and watched all morning, sometimes tapping on the glass. In all the years since, it's Massa's sadness that stays with me. The in-betweenness of being raised as a human when he was tiny and then being given away and treated as an animal again. The specter of this solitary existence, his never having community with other gorillas, still haunts me. Did Massa remember the woods and the greenery, the thick dark forest, the last time he felt the clasp of his mother's hands? Or did his human owner, Mrs. Lintz, pick him up as an infant, cuddle him